Joy Cometh in the Morning by Kathleen Redman Strange. A big tear splashed onto the dusty lid of the battered old trunk before which Cynthia Payton was kneeling. For the past 15 minutes, she had knelt before that relic of the happy past, striving to fight back the temptation to insert the key, raise the lid, and discover once and for all the answer to the enigma of her father's parting words, whispered into her ear as he had kissed her goodbye on the landing stage at Liverpool 2 long years before.
"If ever things become too difficult, my dear, here is sufficient to bring you back."
And the old man had slipped into her hand a small, sealed package. Cynthia had carefully and secretly tended that precious package all the way across some 3,000 miles of ocean and 3,000 miles of land to her new home in Alberta. Somehow, during those glamorous first days together, she had never found the courage to confide its existence to Ian. Ian expected her to make good with him in this strange, new life into which they were so gallantly venturing. He would never for a moment admit the possibility of defeat, either for himself or his wife. Sometimes, listening to her youthful husband's exuberant optimism as to their future, Cynthia had felt a secret thrill of guilty shame. Ian had such a buoyant faith in her, so much confidence in her loyalty and cooperation. She hated to confess, even to herself, that there was the remotest possibility that she might ever become a quitter. Yet, so long as she preserved the secret of the existence of the little package, she knew that she was not worthy of his loving faith and trust.
"If ever things become too difficult,"
her father had said. The girl rose from her knees with a sigh, slipped the key into her pocket, and climbed down the narrow attic stairs into the warm sunlight of her own little bedroom. This was not the first time that she had successfully fought back the temptation to open her father's gift and seek the relief which he had promised her its contents would provide. But perhaps because the long summer day had been particularly hot and oppressive, and because she was feeling more than usually tired and depressed, she had come nearer today to the revelation of its mystery than ever before. What did the package contain? She asked herself as she went about her household tasks. In some form or other, it offered her the possibility of escape from her present uncongenial surroundings. That much she knew from her father's parting words. Yet it seemed strange that he should have enjoined upon her the request that she should not open the package until things became too difficult. Cynthia attacked a pile of greasy supper dishes rebelliously. Her mind seemed to be obsessed these days with the difficulties of her situation. She had nothing to look forward to, she told herself, but hard, drudging work from morning till night, unspeakable loneliness, an environment to which she felt she could never adjust herself. The late evening sun, sinking in a glory of crimson and gold over the western horizon, struck across her fair, bent head. Her fine, oval face, with its small, delicate features, was flush. Little beads of perspiration stood out upon her broad forehead, from which the fair, straight hair was brushed back in smooth severity, moulding the lines of the finely shaped head. Not a pretty woman, this Cynthia Payton, but possessing that distinctive charm which is the most outstanding attribute of so many Englishwomen of her type. The girl's heart was heavy with homesickness. Even Ian's love, his tender companionship, his thoughtfulness could not quite compensate her for the lack of all the things which, she told herself, made life worth living. She longed for the friends and associations of her girlhood, the congenial, luxurious surroundings of her father's beautiful home in Surrey, for the 1,001 social amenities that had lent colour and interest to the passing days of youth. Out here on the prairies, it was just a round of hard, manual tasks from morning till night, month in and month out. It had not seemed so difficult at first, because the novelty of everything had somewhat intrigued her. Afterwards, when they had settled down into a more or less humdrum routine of work, what was it for her but succession of commonplace, drudge-like duties, dishwashing, house-cleaning, cows to be milked, chickens to be fed, 100 minor chores demanding attention every hour of the day, and during the busy seasons, at seed time and harvest, far into the night.
If ever things become too difficult.
The words rang in her head like a refrain. Cynthia lifted her gaze from a pile of greasy dishes, but her eyes, staring out of the small square pane of the window in front of her, failed to absorb the sheer beauty of the scene that lay spread out like some vast panorama of field and lake and wooded hillside clear to the distant horizon. The grain fields were all cut now, orderly little stooks standing at regular intervals in the big field by the house awaiting the morrow's threshing. Little poplar bluffs fringed the road allowance. Here and there she could glimpse the friendly outline of a neighbour's house. Some people raved about this big, barren country, thought the girl, but for her these broad, fertile acres, the long, lonely trails, could never measure up to the picturesque beauty of her own English countryside.
If your husband would send you home for a holiday,
a neighbour had told her one day, when in a moment of depression she had given voice to some of her grievances,
you'd soon be cured. I was pretty much that way myself, years ago when we first came out from Scotland. And after a while Bob saw how it was with me and made me take a trip back to Edinburgh. But, Lord bless me, I'd no sooner set foot in the old country than I wanted to be back. I'd never have believed it if you'd have told me so before I started. I went to stay for 3 months, but inside of 3 weeks I was back on the boat and glad to say goodbye to the old shores.
I'm sure if I went home, I'd never want to come back.
Cynthia had answered decidedly.
But it's useless to think of such a thing with crop prospects as they are.
As she stacked dishes with tired, mechanical fingers, Cynthia staged a silent mental battle, her pride, her courage, her sturdy British grit, fighting for the ascendancy over the longing and heartache of homesickness. She was not the first young woman to feel this way, for thousands of young wives, coming to Western Canada from distant lands, have fought the same bitter battle, and surprising tribute to the lure of these wind-swept prairie lands, only a few have admitted defeat. Cynthia pulled herself together with an effort. Ian must not see that she had been crying. She must not let him realize until the final moment of decision that she was tempted daily, hourly, by the overwhelming desire to run away from it all. Run away despite their mutual love, the many dear associations of the past 2 years. Run away because she was homesick and heartsick and incredibly lonely. Once only she had pleaded with Ian to take her home, but his reply had been typical of his dogged ambition to make good.
I'll never be called a quitter.
He had told her stubbornly.
You surely wouldn't have me go back home, a self-confessed failure. You may call it a false pride, my dear, that makes men want to build up on their own efforts and not be beholden to others for a start. But I tell you, Sunny, it's worth it. That's why I came out here, because I knew we could never get anywhere on our own resources in England. This is a man's country, chock full of opportunities. We've just got to stick it out, kiddie, and make good. One of these days I'll take you home for a real holiday, and then we'll make up for some of these hard times. Not that they really are hard times compared to what some of our neighbours went through in the old days.
But those people never knew anything very different.
Cynthia had argued in defence of her plea.
Most of them were poor in the East, and for them Western Canada not only offered boundless opportunities, but it offered the prospect of a more comfortable existence than they had known. Whilst you and I have always had things pleasant, that's what makes it seem so difficult.
But for once, Ian, usually so sympathetic and understanding of the girl's every mood, had seemed unable to grasp the significance of her problems. He loved this wholesome, creative work out here in this big, broad country. Loved to labour in the fresh, sweet earth to the creation of something that was animate and of real vital necessity to the world. It gave him a sense of satisfaction and fulfilment that he would not have exchanged for boundless material riches, and he could not understand why Cynthia should not share in this serene contentment and sensation of well-being with him.
If ever things become too difficult.
The hateful, tempting words were still ringing in the girl's head as Ian pushed open the door of the kitchen and came wearily into the room.
Gee, but I'm tired.
He exclaimed, dropping into the nearest rocker and mopping his moist brown face with a huge red handkerchief.
We sure had a hard day in the fields, but the boys worked well. Threshed 1,500 bushels of wheat. At that will be cleaned up by noon tomorrow.
Thank heaven.
Cynthia exclaimed with a sigh of relief. She had been unable to obtain any help in the kitchen during threshing this year, and it was a heavy job for one pair of hands cooking and caring for a big crew of hungry men.
The crop is turning out better than I thought.
Ian continued.
In fact, I think our fields are going better than most.
There was pride in his tone, pride in a job well done. Clean, well-worked fields, the best seed grain that he could purchase, intelligent planning. These were his watchwords towards progress. Cynthia remained silent, but she glanced across curiously at the tall, overall-clad figure sprawling in the rocker. It was difficult to realise that this was sleek, handsome Ian Paynton. This bearded, tanned young giant with the grimy, dust-streaked face and work-roughened hands. She looked down at her own work-roughened fingers, the soiled gingham house dress which she had been too weary to change. She felt a moment of nausea, of sheer physical revulsion. Her sensitive, fastidious nature resented the outward evidences of their toil.
Thank heaven winter is coming,
Ian said, breaking the silence.
That's one thing about this country. A fellow does get a chance to lay off work for a hit during the winter months. That is, if he hasn't too many chores.
He came over to his wife's side and put an affectionate arm about her slim waist.
Let's get around a bit this year, old girl. Try and make a few friends, eh? There's some darn nice people right near us, you know. If only we let them know that we want to be friendly. You'll try, won't you, Cinny?
There was a wistful, pleading note in his boyish voice.
Don't ask me,
Cynthia murmured. She dreaded the winter, with its short shut-in days and the long, frozen nights.
The people are so funny around here. I don't believe they like me, anyway.
Nonsense. Of course they like you, dear.
Ian protested, but he knew there was some little truth in the girl's words, for she had, from the outset, stubbornly refused to make friends with those who had been anxious and willing to help and encourage and cooperate with her. Perhaps Ian sensed something of Cynthia's mental anguish. He let his arm fall abruptly, a little hurt at her lack of response.
Let's go to bed,
he suggested, wearily.
Sleep is the best medicine of all, and we've another hard day ahead of us tomorrow.
That night, long after her husband had fallen into a sound slumber, from which there was little fear of his awakening suddenly, Cynthia slipped from his side and made her way once more to the little attic. This time she did not hesitate. The key turned easily in the lock. She raised the lid. Down beneath a pile of folded sheets her hand touched the crisp, crackling wrapping paper. She drew it out. So small, yet what enormous potentialities it contained. On the package her own name, written in her father's neat, precise handwriting. Tears suffused her eyes at the dear, familiar hand. Only 2 years since she had seen him, yet an eternity seemed to lie between that sunny June day on the crowded wharf and the present. Her fingers trembled as she broke the thin, red cord that bound the small package. Somehow she felt that with this simple action the die was cast, that she had made the irrevocable decision. Inside the brown wrapping paper, Cynthia found 2 sealed envelopes, both addressed to my dearest daughter. She picked up one, hesitatingly, with a vague sense of bewilderment. Her fingers trembled a little as she slit the flap and drew forth the single sheet of paper that the envelope contained. It was a crisp printed certificate, a bank draft for £100, $500. These lean years, the money sounded like a small fortune in her ears. Dear, generous old Dad, more than enough to take her home in comfort. The money was at last in her hands. There was nothing now to prevent her going, nothing except Ian. In her excitement, she had almost forgotten her husband. Ian, who loved her, trusted her, depended on her. Ian, her chosen man, her comrade. She was planning to leave him. Cynthia buried her face in her hands.
"Oh, God help me to stick."
She prayed incoherently, yet the words sounded hollow in her own ears. She could not wrench her eyes from the printed slip, could not shut out the vision of home and dear ones that the sight of it brought so poignantly to her tired mind. Then she remembered the second envelope, and opening this, she found several sheets of notepaper, covered closely with her father's handwriting. It was a letter bearing a date 1 week previous to her departure for Canada. Curiously, in the flickering candlelight, Cynthia began to read.
My dearest daughter, now that you have opened this package, it is because you have found things unendurably difficult, because you have decided that to return to your own home and your lonely old father is the only solution to your difficulties. With this letter you will find a bank draft for £100, my gift to you. This will be more than sufficient to bring you home, both of you, in comfort. But before you come to a definite decision, my daughter, I want to tell you a story. When you were born, your mother and I were desperately poor. She had estranged herself from her parents, who were wealthy and influential in those days, because she had chosen to marry me, a struggling young lawyer. But we counted ourselves rich in happiness because we had each other and you, and we possessed the riches of love in abundance. After you were born, your mother fell sick. She became the victim of a fatal wasting disease. Good doctors and proper care might have prolonged her life and eased her sufferings. But these she could not have. One day in desperation I appealed to your grandfather. He agreed to do everything that was necessary for your mother on one condition, and that was that she leave me and return to her own family. You were to be brought up under the family name. Your mother refused, as I knew she would. She paid the price of her choice. In less than 3 years she died, her life a very real sacrifice for love. Her husband, her child, the harsh surroundings of the little home that we had built up together, the toil and poverty of those early days were all more than worthwhile to her, even at the cost of her life. You, my little Cynthia, have been meeting some of life's problems. I have lived a long while, and I know that however hopefully we start out, we are bound, at some time or other, to come up against those snags, those thorny hedges that seem so difficult of surmounting. I cannot very well imagine what your life in Alberta will be like, but I do know this, that you have chosen wisely in your mate. You have a gallant young English gentleman, one who is not afraid to answer to his country's call and to seek a new life in a strange land. He has all the courage and grit which are characteristic British qualities and which will eventually bring him success in whatever he undertakes. But if you are meeting difficulties along the road and becoming discouraged, think of your dear mother's example. Look out and above your own petty troubles. Always you will find someone with problems worse than your own. Try to absorb the beauty of your surroundings, to appreciate your neighbours, however uncongenial they may at first appear. Lift up your eyes, my dear, and behold the stars. If, after reading this letter, you still feel that you cannot face your troubles, come home to me, your father.
Cynthia sat for long minutes, regarding the letter through a mist of tears. Drifting memories came back to her, memories of a fair, frail figure bending over her own white crib in a tiny shaded room, of a sweet, husky voice singing to her when she was tired of play. Her mother. She had never really known her mother. Her father seldom spoke of her. All these years he had lived with his memories. He had treasured the story of her devotion, her loyalty, her courage and her sacrifice against the day when her own daughter might be called upon to face some momentous issue. Shame, like some dark enveloping cloud, crept over the girl. Shame that she had so nearly succumbed to temptation, had so nearly become that most despicable of all failures, a quitter. Like a flash of light, the realization came to her that she would never now be tempted again. She would never desert her man, her home. Looking back over the past 2 years, Cynthia realized, almost as if for the first time, that she had never even tried to adjust herself to the conditions of her life, had deliberately misunderstood and rebuffed the advances of friendship made her by her neighbours, had closed her eyes to the real beauty of land and sky because she had been looking inwards at her own petty problems.
I've been looking down at the mud,
she told herself,
when I might have been feasting my eyes on the glory of the sky.
Tomorrow she would tell Ian everything. Her homesickness, her temptation, her temporary disloyalty of thought. Ian would understand and forgive. For her, henceforth, a new life, new thoughts, new ideals. A fresh start with a keener, surer courage. A faint light was streaming in through the little narrow window under the eaves. Day was dawning over the hills. A new day, pregnant with possibility, with the promise of fulfillment. A few minutes later, as she crept back into bed, an old familiar phrase slipped into her sleepy mind.
For joy cometh in the morning.
And with a happy smile upon her face, Cynthia fell asleep